friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters on Armstrong Cable Television. We're delighted that you're here, and we're delighted to welcome Eric Douglas as our guest. This show is so much fun because it gives me an opportunity to talk to authors, sometimes editors, sometimes publishers, sometimes now booksellers in our region and beyond. And it gives you the opportunity to hear about the newest books that are coming out and the newest authors that are making their way into publishing. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks,
Eric is here at least for the second time because he's so prolific. He's written 23 books, you said?
23 books in total, yeah.
23 books and counting, I hope.
And counting.
Right.
Sheila and I were just discussing that. Sheila Redling and I were just discussing the next ones. All
right, Eric is a journalist and a writer and has been his entire professional career. Currently, he is actually the news director for West Virginia Public Broadcasting. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. That's a new occurrence, but thank you.
Right. Born and raised in West Virginia, he learned to scuba dive in Summersville Lake before moving to California and North Carolina to work in the scuba industry. He's also written about diving for many magazines, including the ongoing Lessons for Life column in Scuba Diving magazine. Held Hostage is his 23rd book overall, including both fiction and nonfiction works. He estimates he's written over 1 million words about his hero, Mike Scott, protagonist. That's just those books alone.
That's just that book.
Yeah. And they always feature diving, adventure, exotic locations, and the environment. So we're thrilled to have you.
Thank you, Carter. Good to be here. Good to see you.
So how many?
Good to see you in person.
Yes. How many? Yeah, because our last one was Zoom, right? All right. So how many Mike Scott novels are there?
There are, in the Mike Scott series, there's 11 novels and novellas. There's 2 novellas in there, but so 9 novels, 9 full-length novels and 2 novellas, and 3 or 4 short stories thrown in there just for kicks too.
Okay.
But yeah,
You really like this guy, don't you?
I tell you what, when I wrote the first Mike Scott book, I thought I didn't want to do, I read thrillers. I didn't want to do some guy who works for some nameless government agency. I didn't want that. But I wanted somebody with an excuse to travel and go to all these exotic locations. I came up with a journalist, and Mike's had a lot of fun. Although there's one of my readers tells me that he would never want to go on vacation with Mike because he always gets in some kind of trouble when he goes on.
So is he your alter ego?
I get asked that a lot, and there's certainly some things. With a few exceptions, there's very little Mike does in the books that I haven't done. I've been to most of the places the books are set in. I've done the types of diving he's done. So there's some of that. Actually, the full backstory on Mike Scott is he's actually named for a dear friend of mine who, this goes back to 1989, who died of cancer. His name was Michael Scott Burnsworth, so that's where Mike Scott came from.
I see.
And so the physical description of Mike Scott and everything is him, and this is my way of kind of imagining what his life would have been like. He was 22 when he died. Yeah,
that's a good story.
This is my way of imagining what could have happened to him if he'd lived.
But some of his adventures are some, in a sense, that you've had.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So it's a blending of the two.
It's a blending. Okay. Yeah.
All right. So tell us a little bit about the new novel called Held Hostage.
It's interesting that, Held Hostage specifically is, Mike's just about to get married. And this has been ongoing for the last 5 or 6 books, this burgeoning romance. But he's about to get married, and his fiancée gets kidnapped. She's an archaeologist. She's an underwater archaeologist, and she gets kidnapped by this man who's looking for this shipwreck. And it's a real shipwreck. The Nuestra Senora de Juncal is a real Spanish galleon that went down off the coast of Mexico. Okay. And so all that's real. All the descriptions in the book of the shipwreck and all that are real. And the place where it is? And the place where it is just off the coast of Merida, off the Yucatan in Mexico, in the Bay of Campeche. That's the entire, or 90% of the book is actually set on board boats. There's very little land stuff on, but there's a couple times he's in Merida and places like that, and that's all. Those are all places I've been. Those are all places I've had the good fortune of traveling to. But so the whole book is about the search. Well, Mike is searching for the shipwreck as well, because he knows that's the quickest way to find where the man has kidnapped his fiancée Frankie, and
Because he's looking for it too.
he's looking for it too. He kidnapped her to get her help to find the shipwreck. So Mike is also looking for it, and so there's
So it's a race as to who gets there first. in a sense.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the whole kind of the crux of the book. But
Yeah. Right.
kind of the backstory of the book is Mike dealing with the whole issue for him in the book is how he worries about putting Frankie in danger because of some of the things he gets into. And so he's struggling with her suddenly being in danger, and how to protect your loved ones and that sort of thing too. So that's kind of my underlying subplot of the book.
Yeah. All right, so when you set out to write a new adventure for Mike, how do you decide the setting or the dilemma that you're going to have him in that he has to work his way out of?
I know Mike very well at this point. I mean,
Yeah.
like you said, there's been a million words ish about Mike Scott. So I know him as well, probably as I know myself on some levels. But he's grown certainly. From the first couple books, he was an adventurer out, running around, and now he's getting a little older.
Aren't we all?
Aren't we all? Probably lost a step, as some of us have anyway. And he's, so he's kind of growing, and so I wanted to give him a little bit more of that depth and a little bit more of the human dilemma versus just, chasing bad guys and that kind of thing. But it's really just kind of comes from inspiration in the news or places I've been, and I think, in a different part of my career, I was traveling a lot. Internationally, I was traveling a lot. And so I was always kind of taking notes and making notes of things about going on in the world. With this story, the search for the shipwreck, for 40 years, Spain and Mexico have been arguing over who had the rights to it. Mexico wouldn't let Spain search for it, but Spain never gave up the rights to the ship, but it was in Mexican waters, so they wouldn't let them search for it until they finally came to an agreement just like 2 years ago. So this past summer, when I was writing this book, they had just done their first expedition actually for it. So I saw that in the news and kind of knew about what was going on, and that sparked my imagination to, what would Mike do if he were searching for it? And then we were off to the races. And a lot of them are like that. I'll see things in the news, as you mentioned. All my books have are interested in the ocean and the environment, and so I see things in the news that go, well, that's pretty interesting. Maybe that's fodder for a Mike Scott story, and I keep a file of links or stories and that kind of thing that I can come back to later.
When did you first start writing Mike Scott?
The first book, which was Cayman Cowboys, was actually published 17 years ago in 2005.
Okay, so from that time to now, I would bet that dive equipment has changed.
Believe it or not significantly.
Because I learned to dive in the 90s, and there were no computers.
Yeah, you're right. Dive computers are a bit more common now, although from 2005, most divers had at least access to dive computers. Actually, probably the biggest thing is photographically, because Mike is an underwater photographer. Up through to about 2007, 2008, everyone was shooting film underwater. And then the digital revolution for the cameras came along, and you started putting DSLRs in housings. And I remember actually the first version of Cayman Cowboys, the first edition of Cayman Cowboys, I referred to a practice a lot of underwater photographers used to do at the time. They would carry a couple cameras with them because you only had 36 exposures on a roll of film. And you certainly couldn't change the film underwater. So they would carry 2 or 3 cameras with them. And I actually did in about 2012, I did an updated version. I updated just a few things in the book, and I switched it to digital photography because that was a huge change for underwater photographers.
Absolutely.
So some of that changed. And probably the other biggest thing is in the diving world is rebreather technology. Where as compared to open circuit scuba, where you have a tank on your back and you're exhaling bubbles, They're what we call rebreathers that scrub out your exhaled carbon dioxide and allow you to stay deeper, longer, and that kind of stuff. So that's the other big change. I've used rebreathers a little bit, not a whole lot in my books, but I kind of try to stay more the stuff that's available to the average person.
I see.
Rather than that's pretty expensive and pretty technical.
Okay, yeah. All right, so you've talked about the location and the ship and so forth are actual real places.
Yeah, every place is
What
real.
about the character, the historical character, Rose Greenhow?
Yep.
Is she a real person?
That's a real person
That's
too.
a real person.
That's a really interesting Civil War historical character. Yeah, this book starts out. There's basically a vignette at the beginning of it that where Frankie gets in trouble.
Frankie being the girlfriend.
Frankie being the fiance. Yeah. Dr. Francesca DeMarco is her real name, but that's such a mouthful. She became Frankie. But yeah, Rose Greenhow was a historical character from the Civil War. She was with the Confederate side and then ran off to England to escape the oppression she felt from the Union forces. She lived in D.C., wrote a book, and the way she died, I describe in the book, is all true.
Wow.
I'll go ahead and tell the story. She was coming back to the United States with the royalties from her book, but she had all these gold coins sewn into her dress so she could theoretically smuggle them more or smuggle them easier. Then she ended up jumping overboard when the Union ships came, and she drowned because she had all this gold sewn into her dress. But yeah, no, that's a real character. Actually, that's what we were just discussing before we got started here. At the end of the book, I teed it up with, we'll meet up in a couple of weeks in England. Wasn't really prepared to write that story, but I guess I'm going to have to now.
Right. How much research do you do with your stories?
Quite a bit. I not as much as some, but quite a bit. I like to have as much historical accuracy as I can, and a lot of my books have an historical component or especially if it's a shipwreck or something like that's involved. I try to have pretty accurate. But I one of my writing idols is Tom Clancy. And I still remember in one of his books, he spent 3 pages describing like 8 milliseconds of a nuclear explosion. There were 3 pages on that. I don't go into near that kind of detail. But I do like to have enough realism that somebody can say, I've never heard that, and I hope that's true because I've just learned something, and at the same time, kind of get them in the setting of the book as well.
Right. So, did you know about this woman, Rose Greenhow?
Only in passing. A good friend of mine loaned me a book on historical shipwrecks. I just thought I would be interested in it, mostly Civil War shipwrecks, and I was just flipping through it one day, and kind of reading the stories, and actually when I was preparing for this book, I was looking for something off the coast of North Carolina, just something significant that I could kind of include in there. And and I stumbled on this. I was like, wow, this is an amazing story, and did some more research and dug into her and found out the whole gold in her.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah. When I talked to Homer Hickam not very long ago, and he's done a lot of the same thing, diving for certain wrecks and looking for things that. Not necessarily the buried treasure, but looking for, and his obviously his research and yours must be very similar.
Probably, I have a lot of respect for Homer. He actually, and I've actually never met him in person, but he's pretty notable in the diving world too.
I bet
because of his work with NASA.
Yes,
they do a lot of water work because it's as close as you can get to weightless until you go to space.
Right, exactly. All right, so 23 books is a lot. With a full-time job, how do you find time to do that? As they say, you've got a day job.
I do have a day job. And I'll be honest with you, there was a period when I moved back to West Virginia in 2011 until just about 3 years ago that I didn't have a day job. I was doing some consulting and writing full-time. And it was much easier to crank out.
Sure.
And so it's been in a bit of an adjustment. My first 4 books, I believe, I had a day job. And then I quit and moved and came back to West Virginia. So it's been an adjustment, but most of the time is evening or two, evenings, weekends, couple hours here and there. I'm a relatively fast writer. That's one of the advantages for me of being a journalist. Just down the road here,
You learned how to do deadlines.
they learned how to do deadlines, and they taught me how to think into a keyboard. I think I write just as I type. There's not a lot of rewriting in my books, actually. I mean, I certainly go through edits afterwards, but I've learned how to kind of stream of consciousness into the keyboard, and it's at least mostly legible, and then I can polish it up from there. So
Yeah, a lot of people, when I started writing, I was using legal pads and number 2 pencils. So it's taken me a while to think into the keyboard. So it's good that you started as a journalist. It gave you a leg up.
Absolutely, and I still can write. A good day for me is a couple thousand words at a setting, and that's still probably only a couple hours. If I'm on a good roll, 1,000 words an hour is not uncommon for me. I know a lot of respect for them, especially a lot of respect for writers who write less than that, because they still stick with it and they still crank it out. But I guess I'm relatively fortunate in that. Yeah, I can. Sure. If on a good roll, a 10,000 word week is not uncommon.
Wow, that's good. All right, so do you know when you start where the book's going? Do you plot?
I pretend to plot. I at least have rough ideas. And actually,
surely if you get him into a situation, you know pretty much how you're going to get him out.
Most of the time, yeah.
Okay.
There have been a couple of my books where either at the end of the book or at the end of a scene, I've gone, I didn't expect that to happen. It's like, and it's just kind of the way it flowed. I have a rough outline. I am not a detailed bullet points kind of plotter. Actually, there's the book, the follow-up to this book with Rose Greenhow in England, and I haven't even started an outline for that. I have an outline for another book, another Mike Scott book, so so that's at least the next 2 going. But
all right, that brings me to the next question then. When you're in the middle of working on one, let's say while you were writing Held Hostage, did you already have something in the back of your mind that was saying, gee, I need to explore that? That one's like the Rose Greenhouse story. I mean, it wasn't until you got clear to the end and you said, now that's another story I want to work on.
No, you're right. At the beginning of this book, I was, because the Rose Greenhouse story is pretty short. I mean, I didn't go into huge detail in it. I was thinking, I need to explore this more. I need to flesh this out more. And it just kind of happens that way. Sometimes I'll stumble onto things, and there's this other storyline that I saw on the news one time to the effect of there are unexploded munitions all over the ocean that were just dumped after the wars, and every once in a while they explode. And so that's going to be a Mike Scott story, and I've already got that one outlined. I was like, that one, that just kind of wrote itself in my mind. But I've somewhat committed now to doing this other thing that is going to take some research, mainly because I've been to England, but not enough to really write about it. So I'm either going to have to go, which is not likely right now, or I'm going to have to jump into a whole lot of location research.
Right. You also tend to bring back characters that have been in other books. Does this mean that at some point you would do a whole story about them, or is it just because they're part of Mike's kind of entourage?
Mainly, it's Mike's universe. That the first 3 books, I didn't do that at all. Actually, the first 5 books, there were no recurring characters. In the 6th book, I decided to bring Frankie back. And that's where it really kind of started. I started a couple other characters in that book. So that was, the first book was Cayman Cowboys. The sixth book is called Return to Cayman. So Mike has gone back. So I bring back two characters from the island, and Frankie actually appeared in the third book, and so I brought her back in the sixth. And since then, I've definitely been doing a lot more of that. Mike's entourage, Mike's friends,
Yeah.
And it's actually, I think it's been more fun than kind of creating characters from scratch. These are old friends that I get to bring back too, and get to hang out with for a while
Right,
too.
exactly, yeah. When you first started writing, you mentioned Tom Clancy. Is there somebody else whose work you really admired?
Tom Clancy was big for me, especially the Jack Ryan series in the 80s and 90s. Those I remember the way 20 years ago people were sitting in line for the Harry Potter books to come out on. I remember doing that with the Tom Clancy books, with the Jack Ryan books. Probably somebody I modeled myself along for these books though was Clive Cussler.
Oh, uh-huh.
He's that thriller, but also set on islands and in the ocean and shipwrecks and that kind of stuff. So I definitely, I like Clancy, but there's an awful lot of Clive Cussler in my books too.
I understand. You've been diving all over the world, basically. Do you have a favorite place?
Well, the standard answer to that is the next dive. Probably I learned here in West Virginia, had dived in the ocean, in the Keys and Panama, but in 1998, I moved out to Southern California and lived out there for a couple years, and we were diving every week in the ocean and the kelp forest and all that kind of stuff. And I really felt like I really cut my teeth as a real diver at that point. I had 100 or so dives under my belt before I went to California. But I probably, in 2 years, I probably did another couple hundred dives in just that 2 years. We were diving all the time. And I think that's probably one of the things I miss the most is kelp diving. It's cold water, but the critters are bigger. And the kelp, it's like diving through a big a forest, and the sunlight's filtering down through the
Right.
kelp and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
That's probably something I would like to get back to.
Huh. I thought, well, I would, if you ask me, I've only been to one place and really done a lot of diving, and that's the Caymans. 'Cause it's so beautiful.
There's no doubt I want to get back to Grand Cayman. My wife and I both, when there's a resort that we go to, Sunset House, down there, and they've got you couldn't do it today, but they've got a pool carved literally out of the iron shore, and so it's connected directly into the ocean, and you can get inside of that and just kind of float in the ocean water. And they've got shore diving right off so you come up off the boat, the bars right there, they're fixing lunch, and you just smell all that. Yeah, that's pretty idyllic. Yeah,
It certainly is. I totally agree. What other kinds? You've done nonfiction as well. Is that mostly your journalistic work with dive magazines? Is that mostly what it is?
Well, no, I've done a few things. I actually have done a couple documentary pieces. Some of that diving, some of it not. I had the good fortune in the 90s, especially, to travel to Russia a number of times.
Wow.
Right after the Soviet Union broke apart and through the mid 90s. And so I've written a book about those experiences. I did a nonfiction piece, a documentary piece about West Virginia war veterans. I did a collection of oral histories. And
Oh, I remember hearing about that. Yeah.
so I've done that book. I've done a couple of those oral history related sort of things. Another one of my nonfiction books, I did a story, or sat down with a dear friend of mine who was going through breast cancer for the 4th time. And she had 6 chemo sessions set up, and I sat with her for all 6 of those sessions, just put a recorder on the bed beside her while she had the stuff dripping into her arm, and we just talked and talked about the whole experience and everything she was going through. And so that became a book based on those conversations. Yeah, so there's been a number of those kinds of things.
Didn't you also write one about your open heart surgery?
I did. 6 years ago I had open heart surgery myself, and actually still to this day one of my best-selling books, to be honest with you. But it's just, the book is about the year after my surgery, recovering, getting back to diving status, getting my health back to the point that I could go scuba diving again, be cleared to dive again. And, just the things I learned about myself and my body and everything else.
That's amazing.
So, that, and like I said, it's to this day one of my best-selling books.
Yeah. So when was the last time you had a chance to go diving?
I've only been diving in West Virginia in the last couple of years. I've been up to Summersville Lake as recently as last September, I guess. But because of COVID and everything else, I haven't really been traveling.
Right.
So it's been 4 or 5 years since I've been in the ocean somewhere, and I'm really, really itching for it. But I've made at least 3 or 4 dives every year just to kind of keep the rust off. But
right. Otherwise, you have to get recertified.
Exactly. But I'm looking forward to getting back in the ocean and seeing that again.
Yes, right. All right. So your next book that you've already got outlined, that's probably not going to be the next one. The one about Rose is probably going to be the next one.
Rose is probably going to be the next one.
And how far along are you?
I've not.
Oh, you haven't started.
I haven't even started it right. Well, as you were talking.
See, now you've
I've
tempted
committed.
everybody.
I've
You've got
committed.
to do it. Right.
As you were talking about my day job, we just finished the legislative session.
Yeah.
And, so this book just came out in December. And then immediately, as soon as the holidays were over, the legislature was in town, and that destroyed all of my free time. So the session's over now, and I'm hoping to settle down and get working on the Rose book.
That's good. That's good. How long does it usually take you to write a book?
If I do have a solid outline and I know where I'm going, I can probably 6 to 9 months. I can from beginning to end.
Mercy, I'm jealous.
This one took longer than that because I was, I didn't have as solid of a plan as I should have when I started it, and so about halfway through I kind of got hung up and had to reset and figure out where I was going to go. But yeah, I can in 6 to 9 months I can go through drafts and edits and have a solid finished product.
That's fantastic. Tell us how people can get your books, because I know that they're going to be interested.
Well, I hope so. No, I'm kidding. When I wrote my first book, I got a web domain. It was booksbyeric.com because I was convinced I was going to write more than one book.
That's good.
So I was optimistic. But yeah, booksbyeric.com is my website. I've had it for 17, 18 years now. And Eric at Books by Eric is the email address if anybody wants to reach out.
Okay, and you'll sign them and send them right off.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's been so much fun. It was a fantastic book. It kept me on the edge of my seat. I must say, I was worried to death for Frankie the whole time.
But she's tough.
She is tough. Yeah, she is tough. So thanks for watching. We're delighted to have you with us every time we do one of these shows, and we hope you'll come back again for the next one. I'm Carter Seaton, your host, and look forward to seeing you again. In the meantime, stay tuned to Armstrong for all the news and views that impact you.
Connect with Chapters through email. Write to lp4@zoominternet.net. Chapters has a Facebook page at Armstrong Chapters. Like, subscribe, share, and comment. All Chapters episodes are available on YouTube. Visit the Armstrong Neighborhood channel on YouTube and look for a playlist of all the Chapters programs.